Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody. This is Lex, and today's conversation is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more of a monologue, a sharing of my hypothesis about how the story and the world is unfolding. Through the last half decade, maybe decade, I've come to have some really strong convictions and some strong mental models for how fintech works, how financial services is evolving, how technology is spreading into and out of financial services, and also how we consumers, people are getting reprogrammed or used to different modes of engagement. You know, how the attention economy of the phone has changed the way that we consume finance, how that plugs into our lives, and so on. I do think that now in 2022, some of those original assumptions are shifting and morphing, and the way that the players come together and the way that the game theory, the competition between the different players, those players being the fintech companies and the startup ecosystem, the big technology companies, Apple, Google, Amazon, the banks and financial companies, Goldman, JP Morgan, Santander, government actors, regulators, various sovereigns, geographically distributed in different ways and playing their own games, as well as many others from telecoms to the media industry and so on. The way that the interactions between these players come out is leading to some really weird stuff. And so I wanted to just take this time and integrate some of the recent long takes that we've done on the FinTech Blueprint in the written newsletter and try to weave them together into a cohesive story, into a story that's bigger than any particular look at the issues. And so with that, let me try and give it a shot. So we'll start with the fintech story, with which you're, I assume, quite familiar. And I've framed it many different times before. I think that there can be a pretty simple, if not somewhat reductive way to tell it. And that is you pin the start of quote unquote fintech somewhere around 2007 with Mint.com. The data aggregation company that also turned into a personal financial management website and became very valuable, funded at $140 million, sold for $170 to Quicken Intuit, and had millions of users. It was the first example of Web 2, meaning software inside the browser, aimed at financial stuff. So you could see your accounts, you could see your budgeting, or you could start to see some versions of financial planning, your net worth. And it was just super cool. I mean, it was very inspiring for lots of entrepreneurs, me included, to say all this stuff that's trapped on a bank mainframe or an investment firm, portfolio management system, and so on and so forth, could be liberated and become living in a website to be interacted with in the same way that Facebook allows you to interact with other people, in the same way that Google Docs was blowing up what Microsoft had with its desktop software, and so on. And so for me, that's really the start of fintech, and the term fintech to organize all of these attempts, whether it was in banking or lending or investment management, portfolio management, or insurance. All of that term fintech as an umbrella term really emerged around 2012, 2014 as venture capital needed a word for investing in the space. And so wealth tech, neobanks, insurtech, all of that, I think, is included in there. You always need these labels, and they might be frustrating. The label robo-advisor was frustrating at the time. The label metaverse or DeFi or some of the flag waving that people do, that's always going to be frustrating. Democratizing this, decentralizing that. We just have to understand that they're markers. They're stripes that people put on their costume to orient themselves in, and that's okay. And so if you think of fintech as this Web 2 Silicon Valley approach to building attention companies, grabbing distribution, and distributing financial products, it all kind of fits together. You don't have to answer the question of like, well, what about high frequency trading? What about market venues? What about, FIS and Fiserv? It doesn't matter. That's not what we're talking about. And so most of fintech was about taking traditional financial products and building a store that was a digital store instead of a bank branch or a financial advisor or some other human being that would intermediate the selling of a financial product to you. In the same way that, you go to a store and you get a sandwich and now you can Deliveroo or Uber Eats your sandwich, fintech put the mutual fund or the bank account or the trading experience into your website and then into your phone and then made that quote unquote smart, more intelligent, more interactive. And then on top of that, you add the ability to blitz scale, meaning kind of the Amazon growth story. So you get lots and lots of equity, and arguably by traditional investment metrics, your equity is worth negative amounts because you've raised so much, but your company is not generating any revenue. And so you go into negative territory in terms of value, but then your growth story is very aggressive. And so you end up being big and taking a market. And so out of this strategy, out of the digitization of distribution, you had a whole bunch of industry champions. Lending Club, Betterment, Revolut, Chime, Venmo, Square Cash, Cash App, and so on. So you get a bunch of these industry vertical champions, and they're getting millions of users and their attention. They have gamification mechanics like the way Robinhood did. And then they start bundling things back together, right? So SoFi offering not just student loans, but cash accounts and investment accounts and eventually crypto accounts. And if you look at most of the fintech champions, that's what you get. But end of the day, they are just big financial sandwich shops, and they're selling you the same deli meat that was made 50 years ago. So the stuff connects into through embedded finance or through open banking or through some other regulatory arbitrage, whether it's PSD2 in Europe or whether it is the Durbin stuff in the US, connects into some other underlying bank. And often the bank starts contorting itself to be positioned to make these digital shops successful, make it easy for them to integrate their financial products and so on. So you end up with this giant footprint. And frankly, it is super impressive how large these fintech footprints have become. And in some geographies like Brazil with Nubank or Tinkoff in Russia, you do have these companies filling a gap. Or, you can talk about Ant Financial in China, although obviously that's complicated for many reasons. You do have these companies filling a gap, either displacing incumbents or displacing players that would be incumbent, but were adjacent to it. They were a telecom and then a finance company comes into play. And it's amazing that that was successful, that this consumerization of access to financial products did happen. But the fundamental fault is that the deli meat is from 50 years ago, that the products which are made on spaghetti code from 50 different systems with lots of intermediation. Now, intermediation is not wrong. It's not bad. And often when I talk about industry structure and I talk about manufacturing and distribution, I omit the value chain in between. The middle office, the account opening, the KYC, AML, the compliance stuff, the reconciliation of performance reporting. We don't talk about it because that's never a driver. That is never the cause of the thing. Never, in my observed experience, probabilistically weighing its importance, it doesn't seem to be causal. It follows from how do you manufacture and where do you choose to sell? And then you build the bridge. And so intermediation is just fine if your value chain is moving value around in a reasonable way. But when you have kind of fundamental breakthroughs in either manufacturing and distribution, the value chain gets broken and has to be rebuilt from scratch. And so the thing that started to get built from scratch is new versions of financial services manufacturing, new ways to make the sandwich that people buy, new ways to create banking, to create lending, to create investments and trading and insurance. And particularly ways that require absolutely nothing from the old world. So InvestNet and portfolio management from investment is not required for investment management on chain, on a blockchain. Core banking sort of calculations and file management and database syncing is not required in decentralized finance. You don't need digital lending systems or account opening systems. None of that stuff is needed or useful in the architecture that's emerged. And the architecture that's emerged, going from Bitcoin to Ethereum and then broader to the Web3 architecture of, Ethereum as the main settlement protocol, main just in terms of how trusted it is, how much capital goes into securing it, and so on. And then the many adjacent networks, whether it's the layer twos or the rollups or even chains that use different logic and architecture like Solana, or now the Move ecosystem chains, the ones that use Facebook's old programming language, new programming language from the Diem project, the Libra project, and so on. Like all that stuff is emerging as a different computing paradigm, a different internet paradigm, and we call it collectively Web3. And the distinction between Web 2 and Web 3 is an internet of media versus an internet that is able to sustain a human economy. The difference, when I say human economy, I mean an economy that our human brains can understand. So in a simple case, you come into my sandwich shop and you buy a sandwich, you give me money, and then you have it and I don't have it. That's an example of physical scarcity. So the ability for you to actually take the item and have it is really important. In the Web 2 world, in the Google, Facebook, and so on, endless media world, you get a very different outcome. The outcome that you get is that actually digital things are free, i.e. they are worthless. They cost nothing to produce and to clone and to copy. So if I give you a beautiful picture of a sandwich, that's fantastic. But what likely happens is that it's worth nothing to you, in the same way that a single piece of music or a single movie, you wouldn't pay anything for that anymore. And so instead, you have to give me millions of pictures of sandwiches, or you have to give me endless Game of Thrones episodes to justify the HBO subscription. And so I get obese on this media, and then I get addicted to it. And your incentive is to get me addicted to it, because that's the only way I'm going to pay in order to get my dopamine fix. And then in order to get the addiction to be really good, what you do is you create an artificial intelligence at the scale of humanity, and you train it to get people to press on the dopamine button. And so we wrap these advertising machines around our heads, and they customize the media sort of pipe straight into our brains at an enormous scale. And we train these machines to give us pleasure is not even the wrong word. Maybe sort of for the economists out there, we can say the word utility. And, so they maximize our utility in some sense, in this dystopian sense. And we end up in a really weird place. That's not a human economy. We don't understand this, right? Because it's monetized through us clicking on stuff and buying things, but it is within this mode of being force-fed a lot of media that makes us unhappy. And so Web3 is a place of, in some way, reversion. It's a more conservative place. It's a place that's more Hobbesian at its core. It's both more capitalist and more human. So it's a decentralization down to a capitalist structure. And in it, we have digital scarcity, such that a particular piece of media, and right now it's media because we think of the internet as media. That's not going to be the case forever, or even for very long, I think. A particular piece of media has the ability to have digital value and to be scarce, such that when you give it to me and I pay you for it, you don't have it anymore, and I have it. And therefore it means something. And it can be a luxury and it can be a signifier. And so that explains the first motion of NFTs becoming luxury items. So if you look at CryptoPunks or you look at the apes, and you see that celebrities like Jimmy Fallon or, God bless her, Kim Kardashian and her SEC pious fine, you see that the NFTs become consumptive items that signify status that people can wear on, let's call it the internet, but end of the day, sort of Twitter, maybe Discord. They turn these luxury signifiers into, in the same way that if you went to Harvard, you would get the Harvard network as your tribe, and then you would get Harvard on your resume as a signifier. These are just regular human needs. They're not, special in any particular way. They're not fraudulent in any particular way, any more so than trying to chase status through the gold stars of education or trying to work at the best brand. You're trying to buy a signifier that sets you apart. Anyway, this is a long way to say that digital goods on Web3 networks tap back into things that people can understand and make the internet a more inhabitable place for us. Even if right now it feels adversarial or unsafe, it is a more appropriate place for people. And so we've got these big computational networks that can generate the attributes of digital scarcity that can also run software. And software, not like we all have different software running on all our computers, but software that is part of like this digital timeline of truth, software whose output we all agree on. We don't know the outcome that's going to really accrue to that capability. We can make guesses. We can look at it. There are people who say, well, it's much better to actually have lots of software that runs on lots of different computers because that's decentralized and that empowers people to be creative. And like, that's the world we already live in. So why would you want slow, tiny, pixelated computer and only have one of them and then take turns executing programs on it? And the answer, if I were to give an honest answer from my perspective, is because it's new, because it's novel, and because it has opened up a door to a whole set of innovation and outcomes that would not be possible without it. So when these doors open, we don't know the outcomes a priori, but we can guess. And one of these outcomes appears to be the financial services software set and capability of producing financial products can and perhaps will move entirely onto this chassis, because so much of financial services is about trust. So much of the banking world and the regulatory world is, what is the truth? Who has the money? How can I move money between all these different representatives of people who say they custody or own my assets on my behalf? And here the answer is, well, the math does. And the math is secured by this much capital. And we can point to the equation rather than having to bestow various licenses and crowns on different participants. Anyway, that's quite a bit of description for why manufacturing financial products on Web3 rails is interesting. And decentralized finance built a number of small robots, automated market makers, decentralized lending, decentralized insurance, and a variety of others, including fairly complicated derivatives and trading venues and so on, using these rails. I mean, it's fantastic stuff. It's just hundreds of billions of dollars in assets went into this, really interesting experiments, functional software, millions of users. But the outcome has been quite a bit of capital loss. And that's okay, because the stuff in here is risk capital. It's meant to be put at risk. And if it's hacked, if it's stolen and so on, in part, that is the equivalent of putting your money into a bank that gets robbed in the Wild West. We don't want that, but we get where it's coming from. And the risk capital is meant to make the ecosystem stronger. That said, the experience of Terra, and we've written a lot about Terra, as well as some of these failures, coordination failures and centralization failures with Celsius and Voyager and so on, the Three Arrow Capital, show some weakness. That's an understatement. I think Terra shows weakness in DeFi. The Three Arrow Capital, Celsius, Voyager stuff does not show weakness in DeFi. What that shows is weakness in traditional finance and extending too much leverage to a fund that fully controls assets based on bad underwriting criteria. But things like Terra show that you can design a protocol and you can have lots of financial engineering, but the financial engineering is empty. It reflects on no kind of underlying fundamental economic activity. This is the issue with designing protocols that are fully financial, that all the incentives are about market structure. They're about incentivizing people to hold tokens, to stake tokens, to put them into particular kind of mathematical contraptions. But then underneath it is really only this financial exposure to itself. And I think it's a mistake to assume malice in these designs. I don't think that it's malice. And maybe that's naive of me, but knowing some of the players that were involved in helping architect the tokenomics, Delphi Digital around Axie and around the Terra ecosystem, and also having spent a lot of time over the last year and a half building out a cryptoeconomics team and thinking about token design and ecosystems and incentives and mechanisms, and like, how do you create not a product with features, but create a macro economy that incentivizes people to do certain things and so on. I don't think it's necessarily malice or ignorance, but I do think you end up always solving to zero if the only thing you have is financial engineering. And so the answer to me is that the order of productive behavior has been flipped. Web3 stood up a financial sector very quickly because, in essence, the Web3 architecture is economic and financial. But it did not stand up an economy. Now, a lot of people try to take external economies, supply chains, media, and so on, security tokens, and try to bridge them or pull them into the Web3 rails, but it doesn't really work. It's the same way that, if it's the early 2000s and you're working at a record label, trying to make the record label digital is a more difficult and smaller opportunity than trying to build Spotify. Similarly, if you're working at a book publisher in the mid 90s or late 90s, figuring out how to get books on the internet is not the right opportunity. The right opportunity is figuring out how the internet generates websites and content, and then how to index that and be the search engine. And so similarly, taking the old economy and kind of shoving it into the digital world and tokenized world, the blockchain world, is a smaller opportunity than figuring out how does the economic system evolve out of Web3 and what does it grow on its own, what emerges. And for me, that's the Web3 economy, right? So the economy has to come first. If you are on a ship going to a new country, and after months of sailing, you get to the shore and you and your 20 other pioneers get off the ship and you say, okay, now we're going to build a bank, and then whoever builds the bank first will have the most money, and then we can build derivative exchanges around the bank, and then market venues, and then, hey, I'll set up the insurance to prevent bank runs. You're all going to die in a week because you'll starve. You're not doing anything useful. You're just fussing around with money. Money is an abstraction, and so on and so forth. What you need to do is you need to build houses, you need to farm to create security, you need to create like products and economies, and then the population needs to grow, and then you figure out, okay, we've got barter and then commerce, and the commerce has payments in it. And then now that we have lots of GDP in our new little town, how can we build a financial sector to enable GDP growth, to smooth out consumption, and so on. And this is, I think, so far has been one of the errors of the crypto world, is the lack of native economic work. And the native economic work is not the old stuff in a digital way. It's what comes out of the Web3 chassis that is novel and that people can put in labor and create value. And as a result of that, make a living in the new digital environment. I think, I complained about flags before. The new digital environment is the metaverse. I'm not going to be strict about it. I'm not going to follow the idea primarily that the metaverse is this rendered space in VR that you have to kind of like upload your avatar in and really buy into that Zuckerberg vision of it or the Ready Player One vision of it. That's a nice shorthand for us to imagine being digital twins of ourselves. But for me, the real definition of the metaverse is kind of being that third space where you would congregate, right? So Starbucks is a third space. You got the home, the office, and the Starbucks. I think the metaverse is another space that over time becomes meaningfully important to where people spend their time. And where people spend their time is, again, where their social capital has to be, where their social network has to be, and where their fashions and luxury goods live. So digital space, metaverse, lots of ways to get at that. So the question then is, what is the economy? What is the economic output of this digital space? How can we sculpt an answer to that? And I think we're seeing the atomic units of that economy, like the productive units, starting to be formed. People call them DAOs, and I'll call them DAOs. They're not autonomous organizations. They're not autonomous in the way that, the science fiction authors of, Charles Stross and Accelerando would say, the robots have created corporations and are spinning out new economics. These are not intelligences. They're not functioning separate and apart from the human animal. But fine, whatever. People call them DAOs, we'll call them DAOs. Eventually, they'll be robot entities. But for now, they're labor collectives. And it can be, a labor collective in the sense of a nonprofit or an investment syndicate or an artist collective. They're any grouping of people together based on interest and alignment. They organize in ways sometimes to create products and to create profit. And so we can think of DAOs as replacing the LLC, as replacing the C Corp, as replacing the fund, and all the other legal organizations that were innovations for driving economic output in the traditional world. The corporation being one of the biggest unlocks for limited liability. And I think DAOs are that architecture on top of Web3 protocols. I mean, this is profoundly beautiful structure. It's so aesthetic to think about it. It just gives me chills. But you do have human organization come together using tools that leverage the property rights and the digital assets, meaning tokens and ownership, that they're derived from the trust-based protocols in Web3 that come out of Ethereum and so on. And these DAOs are where people contribute labor. And if they're contributing labor, you would hope that there is value created that is then going to drive towards a GDP. If there's not, if contributing labor to a DAO is a pointless exercise and they can't self-organize in a way to make things that people actually care about and want to buy, then the whole project is dead. So assuming that is not helpful, assuming the opposite and figuring out, okay, well, is there a path out of that is a lot more helpful. And so that's my current presumption. And then the question is, if you do have these atomic units of productivity, what are all the things that are necessary to connect them into other parts of the world? Because in the physical world, you need to buy physical sandwiches to eat and survive. And so, one investment thesis that's kind of fun that I believe in is the one around enabling DAOs to be interoperable with other economies. And I think this is an endless opportunity. I mean, it's just profoundly large. So things like we've talked a lot about the CFO suite for fintech companies that are focused on the CFO suite. So things like Brex or Pinwheel, all these payment operations applications, all these things that organize the finance function data layer and project out cash flows and do accounting and tax and so on. These things for traditional companies right now have quite a bit of run and are very popular because regular businesses, whether they are giant enterprise businesses or whether they are small businesses, are very happy to pay for the automation of their financial function inside of their company. Now, that is getting attached to manufacturing in the fintech world, meaning it is getting attached to financial product, right? So Brex wants to provide you expense management because they get to make money on the underwriting. And I think the successful companies here, or the long-lasting companies, end of the day, they either plug into capital or they'll have to horizontally organize the market. They'll have to become a monopoly on distribution, and then they can kind of do the Spotify model where they charge a little bit of subscription to hold all the data. That CFO suite bet is happening around businesses, and it has to also happen around DAOs. But things are much more difficult with DAOs because the market is much smaller. So you have companies that focus on payroll, on FX between tokens, and then on and off ramps. You have companies that focus on how do DAO contributors take their payments on chain and then turn them into a credit card or debit card that's able to buy things in a different place. You have things that focus on voting and governance operations. So the politics of the DAO, how it's managed, because the organization of a small business or a large enterprise is different from the organization of an internet entity. And how that internet entity gets to decisions and what the organizational sort of motions are is also difficult and is being discovered. You get an internationalism inside of these things. You get people from every country in the world coming together with very different expectations, different infrastructure in their local jurisdictions, very different regulations that everybody's exposed to. There's a large, hard problem. And it will only be solved if the opportunity on the other side is large and powerful. And my hope is that it is. And there's a lot of entrepreneurship and capital going into figuring this out. Now, the other question outside of we have these atomic units is what are the products that they will make? And this is a place the sector is quite weak in providing good answers, or historically has been, right? You continue getting people asking, well, what's the product? What's the product? And the answer has been, look at all this trading, look at all this lending. The tokens are the product. And maybe, but if my logic tree, the fairly long and involved logic tree is right, the tokens are just ways to coordinate and to monetize and incentivize human activity and human labor. The products are to be built. And some of the early answers have been around gaming, meaning getting people engaged in how they spend their time for leisure, around media and entertainment, so lots of luxury goods being made all over the place, as well as retail goods, depending, but the equivalent of couture dresses being $10,000 or $100,000, you have similar assets on chain for status. I think the interactive worlds, the metaverse direction is very, very powerful. And I think we'll see a lot of ideation and things being made in there. And as you know, the gaming industry generates a lot of revenue. I think digital assets, the creation of what you wear in digital worlds and how is really important. And I think the social media layers or affiliation layers, maybe not like social media in the sense of it's Twitter, but it's on the internet, the way that Lens protocol looks to be, but more of here is your social network graph and then your identity graph based on your behaviors. All the things that you've done accrue to these particular kind of clumps of who you are. That stuff is going to emerge more and more. And I think those are the types of products that we're seeing now. The packaging for these things are non-fungible tokens, NFTs. And right now, NFTs are thought of as it's a picture, but you trade it and it's scammy. This is an error of thinking. The difference between an NFT and a fungible token is the fungible token is more like money. Therefore, it is more like an abstraction. Right? Because you don't see it, you don't touch it, it doesn't do anything. It is a number and a quantity. And there are things like this that we have in the old world, and they're, money and stocks and tickets and whatever. But the NFT just is an abstraction that says it's a digital object. It's an object that can be anything. And recently at a consensus event, Joe Lubin had a really interesting point about NFTs that I'm going to steal for this explanation and try to incorporate into my thinking here. And that is that today's NFTs are kind of like Web 1.0 websites, like websites in 1997, right? A website in 1997 is flat. It's a bit uninteresting. Nothing happens on it. It's just information. And then a Web 2 website becomes interactive and you can do things on it and it's connected to other things. It is aware of other things through cookies and Web 2, but it is aware of your actions. It's aware of your history. It can read your wallet in the case of a Web 3 approach. And so they become intelligent. And then we can also project things out a bit and talk about them as agents who perform functions on your behalf. So right now to do my Twitter and my social media, I've got a lot of automation from Zapier to RSS feeds to things that read the internet, and occasionally people are involved to curate and do things and so on. I would like for those functions to not be like website logins. I would love for those things to be robots that I hold in my wallet or agents that I hold in my wallet that do things on my behalf based on what I want. They are custom extensions of me, right? Ideally, I would not have to rely on these business entities to exist and solve my problems. Ideally, I would build software machines, or I would buy software machines or rent them, and they would be in my ownership the way I can put them in my pocket, and they would be in my digital inventory. And I think, again, that's a much more human way of thinking about, like, how do I have stuff that helps me? Having a login to Zapier or having a login to Zencaster, which is what I'm recording this on, is one thing. Having a digital microphone in my wallet in the shape of an NFT that can have certain functionality is a different thing. So it starts to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the Web3 economy and the GDP of it could look like. And I think that's where, as an entrepreneur or a builder or an investor, is a really fun place to dig around. It is a very risky place to dig around, meaning it's possible none of the stuff I'm saying happens, but it's also very curious and very novel. So I want to talk next about a few of the limits that seem to be emerging on this thesis, and in particular, the limits of big tech, right? We talked about the interactions of all the different players. And the limits of big tech on this Web3 growth, it's just starting to be revealed. It's just starting to be exposed, because the scale of interest in the blockchain chassis is quite large now, in part because of the regulatory attention to it, in part because of the popular imagination and all of that. So big tech is starting to take positions. And we can also see, for example, in the gaming world, the gaming incumbents taking negative positions, excluding a lot of what I've said from their operations, not engaging or trying to build in this space. And that is most likely a repeatable pattern, meaning it is incumbents defending their turf from a disruptive technology. Not that the disruptive technology here is so good it blows up the incumbents, but that it is so different and it is trying to achieve things in such a different way that if you hold a market position in the previous sort of equilibrium, you're not really going to be super excited about a potentially completely different market structure. You're not going to, unless you have to, try to move yourself off of your monopoly. This is an observation about Apple's recent update for its terms of service, and more generally, Apple's position around app stores. So the way that a lot of the tech companies have set themselves up, and the organizing principle of aggregation theory from Ben Thompson in Web 2 is such that you try to build platforms, and platforms are two-sided networks where on the one side you've got consumers, on the other side you have producers, let's put it that way, and then you have a platform that matches them in some particular way, and the particular way that I've talked about is the giant artificial intelligence machine. But for Apple, it is the App Store. And the App Store is amazing. It's 3.5 million applications inside of a very safe environment, curated by Apple at a huge scale to do any possible thing you could want. Now, if you own an app store, and let's say you're Ant Financial and you've got, a super app and you integrate things into it, or you're Windows and you allow different software to run on the computer, or you're Android, or if you want a finance example is you're Morgan Stanley or Merrill Lynch and you've got an open architecture investment platform on which you put lots of funds that your people sell to others. The financial products show up. These are obviously smaller opportunities than 3.5 million applications in Apple, and that's why finance companies are worth 50 billion and Apple is worth 2 trillion. So Apple has an install base of about 1 billion people. That's more than most countries, all but 2, and it's got enormous market power, right? And so if Apple says there are no NFTs on our platform, then there are no NFTs on their platform. That market power is much stronger than sort of the uncertainty that a regulator creates around, is this a security or not, and then punishing certain examples of people. But end of the day, not stopping the activity at an industry level because they can't chase everybody around. On the Apple side, they digitally control the actual platform, and so they can turn off anybody and anything. And in their most recent update, what they said is, you're not allowed to use NFTs to unlock experiences, meaning you can't make NFTs smarter than a simple media asset. And then number 2 is you can't have payment for these objects using anything other than Apple's in-app payment mechanisms, which is nonsense. That's not how the industry is structured. And number two is it's 30% commission to Apple on anything that goes through their payment system, which immediately says, these purchases are for consumption. They are not for investment or use, right? Because if they were for investment, then Apple would try to charge Fidelity 30% on every single trade of a stock. Then that does not happen. So Apple, therefore, looks at NFTs as if they were retail consumption of digital objects. Apple doesn't charge you when you shop on Amazon for clothes. It doesn't have a 30% markup on that, but it disrespects digital objects because digital objects in the Web 2 paradigm are worth nothing. So if somebody charges $3 for a skin or some other cosmetic addition, whatever, put 30% on top, right? And so this paradigm is incompatible with how Web3 is starting to organize its economy. But Apple OS is able to control it because its footprint is so large and because its ability to allow or disallow the OpenSeas of the world to create apps within its ecosystem is final. And this is a real problem. I love Apple, the company. I have a great experience using their applications. I think this particular market structure makes it impossible or makes it really, really difficult to have the type of permissionless innovation that drives Web3. More broadly, that drives open source that replaces private goods with public goods. You can see this in lots of different places. You can see Apple's market power with Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs becoming the bank account inside of Apple Pay is a lot more powerful than, Bank of America being a single app out of 3.5 million apps within the App Store. That default is deeply valuable. It is a prized possession because the distribution of a big tech company is much bigger than the distribution of the best fintech company. And, we talked again about this tension between what's fintech going to do, what's big tech going to do, what are banks going to do that people didn't know the answers to 5 years ago. And the answer to me is that big tech just will forever have a much broader retention footprint because they're more general. And Apple has a bigger retention footprint than Facebook. Facebook is worth 300 billion. Apple is worth 2 trillion. It has a bigger attention footprint than Google. And it's because of, it rolls up everything into the hardware play. You first start with a hardware play and you spend 100% of your time there out of your day relative to things that are not on the phone. You spend most of your computing time on the phone. I'm overstating the point. What I'm saying is of the time you spend on mobile, you're spending it 100% on the phone. And then once you're in the phone, you are starting to split it between different applications and destinations, right? So Apple is sort of prior to the other attention platforms. And so the time you spend on a social network is just a small part of the time you're spending in the phone. And now you get to, we already talked about the banking Goldman Sachs versus Bank of America example. You get the same thing around advertising. So if Apple wants to create more quote unquote privacy and thereby disintermediate Facebook's ability to target advertising in the iPhone and then compete with them using their own advertising, it's fairly straightforward for them to do. So I think one of the limits that we're all going to experience is the extent to which the companies that have won in Web 2 at the hardware level, at the software level, at the social network level, at the indexing of the internet level, those companies, how much they will restrict or get out of the way for the innovation that's happening in this kind of weird, quirky place that we've landed called the Web3 economy, and therefore the financial sector of the Web3 economy, and so on and so forth. And so I think that's a really interesting question. It's an interesting question too, because it gets us to this other thesis, other topic that I've talked a bit about, which is the infrastructure versus application dialectic. So we talked about how Apple is an app store, an operating system, and how it does not want to create other operating systems within it. It does not want to have recursive app stores inside of the App Store. When you look at Web3 is sort of an app store itself because of the decentralized applications that are being built on that chassis. So accessing ETH-based applications or Polygon-based applications and so on. You are there to choose the things you want to engage in. And so embedding app stores in app stores is a real problem. And so the dialectic is between building the infrastructure, i.e. the open version of the app store, the ability of developers to build things of variety, of things that scale, of things that are engaging, that are well-designed, that are interactive. And on the other side, the actual building of those things, right? So are you selling the gold? Are you getting the gold? Meaning, are you creating the applications? Or are you selling the picks and shovels to mine for the gold, i.e. the infrastructure? And this dialectic goes back and forth. I think in a down market like we are now, there's lots of attention on building the infrastructure, on how do you have a public, open source, permissionless, decentralized infrastructure that lots of people can use. And that's everything from the launch of new protocols, like the Move ecosystem stuff, or it is the decentralization efforts that we see from folks like Infura. There is a lot of investment in infrastructure, which then unlocks the ability to create new applications. And maybe there's going to be infrastructure that is independent of the existing big tech footprint. And that will be really interesting, because if you don't need big tech to get the attention and sit on that hardware, and then you don't need the banks and the legacy financial technology and infrastructure to actually manufacture a financial product, you get to a really strange place. You get to a place that's very independent and can work on its own. And we also see this infrastructure extending to machine creativity. So I talked about DAOs being human collectives. I want to just kind of highlight this bit because I think it's so compelling. But one of the directions right now that's evolving quite quickly is the concept of generative AI. And generative AI is a topic dear to my heart because I love art and design and things of that nature. And generative AI is pointing machine learning and artificial intelligence away from, hey, let's solve particular problems. How can a computer see something? How can a computer read something? And, in those situations, in the prior kind of machine learning situations, what you have is you have a focusing of a gigantic mathematical data set trained on some particular problem, whether it's vision or lending or high frequency trading. And it's pointed kind of down from the top down onto that problem. And so if you're a subject of that, it becomes quite scary. For me, at least, when you would open up Google Photos and have Google tag all your photos automatically, it's both great because it makes things easy, but it's also quite scary because this giant machine has scanned every single face in the history of the last 10 years and is able to identify all these things. Whereas generative AI focuses it the other direction. So instead of identifying things out of the fog, out of complexity, what it does is it hallucinates answers. It generates answers. And the way this works is that you train some neural network on the entire internet, like humanity scale information. You train it on all the images there ever were, all the language that's on every website, and so on. And then you reverse it in order to generate things. And the way you do that is beyond my pay grade by a lot. But the way I understand it is that the learning abstracts all the image information or language information into some multidimensional space. So, it like flattens it out into math. And then you've got a neural network that's trained to navigate around it. So you can tune different parameters to find different points in that space of everything that there is. To navigate it, the recent innovation has been to attach a natural language prompt to it. So you can write whatever. You can say a dog playing cards or a dystopian castle in the sky in the style of Blade Runner. And that natural language model also reduces to some math that can then be attached to the neural network, which is then used to navigate the space of everything that there is and combine in a particular way, the permutations of which are infinite, to give you a thing that fools you into being like, a person totally did that. It looks like a craftsperson has generated the outcome. If you look at the language that comes out of things like Jasper.ai, which creates marketing copy, it looks better than a lot of the writing that I encounter. And then if you look at some of the images that are coming out of DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, these image generation algorithms, and then eventually video generation algorithms, they still have errors, but they don't look like uncanny valley errors necessarily. They look beautifully rendered and complicated, and they look human in their logic. And that's because they are based on human logic. They aggregate human craft. And so I think these generative AI trends are a very big unlock for human creativity. The meme in investing right now is how, this creator economy, how everybody can make stuff, and that's going to be great. And of course, the ability to create things using these prompts is going to be commoditized, and everything's going to look samey and uninteresting and unimportant. But it does create this capability of what I'm calling shallow labor. Labor where all you have to do is put in the prompt. All you have to do is learn how to use the tools. And then the tools create so much value leveraging the skill at the level of humanity that the payoff from the initial creativity is like asymmetrically large. You have to do very little to get a very large outcome, or what used to be a lot of individual labor to produce. And I think this is, to circle back to what I was describing with DAOs as the individual units of producing products in Web3. I think that this shallow labor is perfect for DAO contributors, because often it's hard to organize people and it's hard to get them to do things in a persistent way over time and so on. They come in and out. There's a flexibility to these arrangements. And if you have machine systems that amps up people's productivity to a large degree, you really, I think, map in a very curious way to the DAO structure. So the generative AI systems can help write code. They can help generate websites. They can help generate content. I think they'll very soon be able to generate the virtual worlds, the metaverse worlds that we're talking about, not in an obvious kind of Zuckerberg, we're going to draw a Nintendo Wii space inside of our Oculus goggles type of way. In a more indirect way, I think generative AI will contribute to the creation of billions of digital spaces that people will inhabit. And I think that's profoundly interesting. And so I've started with the fintech story. It feels that I've really walked sideways into lots of different things. And I hope you can see this thread saying transform finance into actually the core thing about finance wasn't transformed into actually you can't transform the core thing about finance unless it's serving a purpose for a different economy, a different space that also needs to be transformed. And then we get to this place of, well, we have to make things and labor in a different way. And that actually requires different political organization. That requires different ways of coming together and making new things. And then what are these things that we could be making? And what are the limits on our ability to make these things and distributing these things? And what does it start to bump into? And then I showed you a couple of different paths of the ways that it can go, of the ways that digital commerce can evolve and then create economies and then get banked by decentralized finance and can help people make different types of living. And so the best I can hope for that you get out of this conversation of me with myself is a feeling of true curiosity and a desire for novelty, and wanting to participate in this space, both as personal growth, but also because it is where growth is happening. It is where you can engage in hopeful thinking as opposed to fixed pie thinking. In the current macro environment with high interest rates, but not high enough to match inflation, where recession is forced on everyone in order to behave well, even though much of the problem has been the fiscal impropriety earlier during COVID. In this current environment, it's kind of hard to find good news. That's a big bummer. Everything is sort of slow motion falling apart. And it's very easy to get caught up in that and forget that it's a cycle, that things go up and they go down. And my antidote to that continues to be looking for the edge of what's possible and to look for the frontier and the novel doors that are being opened. And thereafter, you can make choices. You can choose to be a builder, an artist, a creator, the one making the thing. You can choose to be an investor, a curator, an editor of others, the work of others, and that creates value. And end of the day, it's a choice about where you put your attention. And as we know from a lot of research, attention is basically your consciousness. Where you direct your attention is what you think. And that's the one thing I wouldn't say control, but the one thing that defines us is how we spend our attention. And so if you can choose to direct it towards something that's beautiful, that's productive, that's growing, despite all the noise out there, I think that's a tremendous win. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today. We'll be back to our regular programming soon. And of course, check out the newsletter, and I'll see you next week. Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things FinTech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.